In the quiet, rolling farmlands of western Ohio, the small town of Wapakoneta rests under vast, open skies. It was here, in the early 1930s, that a young boy would first look up and feel the pull of the heavens. The streets were lined with modest homes, and the rhythms of daily life moved to the hum of summer cicadas and the distant drone of crop dusters. In this peaceful, unassuming setting, Neil Armstrong was born on August 5, 1930, into a world still captivated by the early feats of aviation. His father, Stephen, worked as an auditor for the Ohio state government, a job that demanded precision and integrity, while his mother, Viola, nurtured a home filled with curiosity and quiet encouragement. From the very beginning, the Armstrong household valued learning and steady discipline, qualities that would shape Neil's character as surely as the Ohio seasons shaped the land. Neil's fascination with flight began remarkably early. When he was just 2 years old, his father took him to the Cleveland air races, where the roar of engines and the sleek shapes of racing planes left an indelible impression. As he grew, he devoured aviation magazines and built model airplanes with meticulous care, his small hands learning the patience of an engineer. The sky was not just a backdrop to his childhood, it was a canvas of possibility. In Wapakoneta, where the horizons stretched unbroken, a boy could dream without limits. The local airfield became a place of pilgrimage, and Neil would often bicycle there just to watch the planes take off and land, studying every movement with an intensity that belied his years. His was a disciplined curiosity, not a fleeting fancy. He wanted to understand how flight worked, not merely to witness it. By his early teens, Neil's passion had crystallized into a clear goal. He would become a pilot. He took on odd jobs, mowing lawns, sweeping floors at a pharmacy, to save money for flying lessons. The cost was $9 an hour, a significant sum in the mid-1940s, but he was determined. At the age of 15, he began training at the grassy Port Conetta airfield, learning the fundamentals of flight in a small Aeronautics Champion. The aircraft was simple, fabric-covered, and responsive to every gentle touch of the controls. His instructor, a patient man who recognized the boy's serious demeanor, guided him through the basics. Neil absorbed everything with a calm, analytical mind, treating each lesson as a problem to be solved. He learned to read the wind, to feel the airplane's subtle signals, and to make decisions with a cool head. On his 16th birthday, even before he obtained his driver's license, Neil Armstrong earned his student flight certificate. It was a quiet triumph, marked not by celebration, but by a deepening sense of purpose. The sky had accepted him. Throughout these formative years, his family provided a steady foundation. His father's work ethic and his mother's gentle wisdom taught him that achievement came through consistent effort, not flashy displays. The Armstrong home was filled with books and maps, and dinner-table conversations often turned to science and current events. Neil's younger siblings, June and Dean, looked up to their older brother, who seemed to carry a quiet confidence. The family attended church regularly, and the values of humility and service were woven into the fabric of their lives. There was no pressure to be extraordinary, only a supportive environment where curiosity was fed and diligence was expected. This balance of freedom and structure allowed Neil to pursue his aviation dreams without losing sight of the grounded, practical world. He excelled in school, particularly in mathematics and science, his notebooks filled with precise diagrams and calculations. He was not the most talkative student, but his teachers noted his steady focus and his ability to grasp complex concepts with ease. The Wapakoneta of Neil's youth was a place where community mattered. Neighbors knew each other, and the town took pride in its schools and its public library, a stately building where Neil spent countless hours. The architecture of the downtown, with its brick storefronts and shaded sidewalks, reflected a sense of permanence and order. On summer evenings, the light would slant golden across the fields, and the smell of freshly cut hay would drift through the open windows of the Armstrong home. It was a landscape that encouraged reflection, a perfect incubator for a mind that would one day navigate the void between worlds. The local newspaper chronicled the exploits of aviators like Charles Lindbergh and Amelia Earhart, and each story added fuel to Neil's imagination. He began to see flight not just as a thrill, but as a discipline, a craft that demanded the highest levels of skill and judgment. As he approached the end of high school, Neil's path seemed clear. He would study aeronautical engineering, a choice that married his love of flying with his analytical nature. The U.S. Navy's Holloway Plan offered a way to fund his education while serving his country, and it required a commitment to both academic excellence and flight training. It was a demanding road, but one perfectly suited to a young man who had already learned to balance ambition with meticulous preparation. His years in Wapakoneta had given him more than just a dream. They had instilled in him a methodical approach to turning dreams into reality. The boy who had once gazed up at the Ohio sky was now ready to take his place among the pioneers of a new frontier. His journey from the quiet fields of his hometown to the surface of the moon would be built on the humble, sturdy foundation laid in those early years, a foundation of family, curiosity, and an unwavering commitment to doing things right. Looking back, Neil Armstrong's childhood was not marked by dramatic events or heroic gestures. Instead, it was a steady accumulation of small, purposeful steps. The model airplanes carefully assembled on his desk, the hours spent at the airfield watching and learning, the patient encouragement of his parents, all of these were threads in a tapestry of preparation. He learned early that mastery was a slow process, that the sky rewarded those who respected its laws and approached it with humility. This philosophy would serve him well in the years to come, through war and test flights and the unimaginable silence of space. But it all began in Wapakoneta, under those wide Midwestern skies, where a boy with a quiet determination first spread his wings and dared to imagine the impossible. Imagine a crisp autumn morning in West Lafayette, Indiana, 1947. The red brick buildings of Purdue University stand quietly under a pale sky, their windows catching the first light. Among the students walking the tree-lined paths is a young man from Ohio, Neil Armstrong, carrying textbooks on aeronautical engineering. He had arrived here under the Holloway Plan, a U.S. Navy program that paid for his tuition in exchange for future service. This arrangement allowed a boy from a modest background to pursue his passion for flight with rigorous academic training. In the lecture halls, Armstrong absorbed the principles of fluid dynamics and aircraft structures, but his mind often drifted to the airport nearby, where he could put theory into practice. The campus, with its blend of tradition and innovation, shaped his disciplined, analytical approach to every challenge. Even then, he was known for his quiet intensity, a student who spoke little but understood deeply, always methodically working through problems while others rushed to conclusions. After 2 years of study, the Navy called him to active duty in 1949. Armstrong traveled to Pensacola, Florida, where the humid air clung to the white hangars and the roar of engines was a constant backdrop. He earned his wings as a naval aviator, mastering the art of landing on aircraft carriers, a task that demanded absolute precision and calm. Soon, he was deployed to the Korean War, flying the Grumman F-9F Panther from the deck of the USS Essex. The Sea of Japan stretched endlessly beneath him, its gray waves punctuated by the steel silhouette of the carrier. On one mission, his plane was hit by anti-aircraft fire, losing part of a wing. Armstrong managed to nurse the damaged jet back to friendly territory, ejecting just before it crashed. That moment revealed his defining trait. Under extreme pressure, his heart rate barely rose, and his mind focused solely on the engineering of survival. He analyzed the aircraft's remaining capabilities, adjusted his trajectory, and acted without panic. This cool-headedness would become his hallmark. Returning to Purdue in 1952, Armstrong completed his degree with a deepened respect for the machines he flew. The campus had changed little, the same brick pathways, the same autumn leaves, but he now carried the weight of combat experience. He studied not just to pass exams, but to understand every nuance of flight. His professors noted his exceptional ability to connect theoretical concepts with real-world applications. After graduation, He joined the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, or NACA, at the Lewis Flight Propulsion Laboratory in Cleveland. There, amidst wind tunnels and drafting tables, he worked on improving aircraft engines. But his true desire lay in the cockpit, not just the laboratory. Soon, he transferred to the high-speed flight station at Edwards Air Force Base in California, a place where the desert stretched like a golden sea and the sky was a boundless blue dome. Edwards in the 1950s was a crucible of aviation progress. The dry lakebed runways shimmered in the heat, and the air smelled of jet fuel and dust. Armstrong arrived as a test pilot, joining an elite group of men who pushed experimental aircraft to their limits. He flew over 200 different models, from the sleek X-15 rocket plane to the cumbersome B-29 bomber. Each flight was a careful experiment. He would methodically note every vibration, every instrument reading, treating the sky as an extension of the laboratory. His colleagues marveled at his ability to describe complex malfunctions in simple, precise terms. Once, while piloting the X-15 to the edge of space, he inadvertently bounced off the atmosphere and had to make a steep recovery. His voice on the radio remained steady, as if discussing a routine calculation. This analytical mindset set him apart. He saw aircraft not as romantic symbols, but as systems to be understood, diagnosed, and improved. His daily life involved early mornings in the hangar, studying blueprints under harsh fluorescent lights, then stepping into the brilliant desert sun for a flight that might last minutes, but felt like hours. One of Armstrong's notable test flights involved the Boeing B-29, a massive propeller-driven bomber that had been modified to carry experimental payloads. On a clear day, with the San Gabriel Mountains rising in the distance, he guided the lumbering giant through maneuvers that tested new aerodynamic theories. The cockpit was cramped and noisy, but he found comfort in the familiar array of dials and switches. Every flight was a lesson in humility. The machines often revealed flaws that no equation had predicted. He learned to respect the limits of engineering while constantly seeking to extend them. This period also saw him flying chase planes for other pilots, watching their tests with a critical eye, always ready to offer a calm suggestion if something went wrong. The desert base, with its stark beauty and isolation, became a place where his skills sharpened against the whetstone of risk. In 1958, NACA transformed into NASA, and the focus began shifting toward space. Armstrong, however, remained dedicated to atmospheric flight for a time, continuing to test new designs. He was part of the team that developed the reaction control system used in the X-15, a precursor to the thrusters that would later maneuver spacecraft. His work was often unglamorous, long hours in the control room, poring over telemetry data, or sitting in a cockpit on the ground, rehearsing emergency procedures until they became instinct. Yet this meticulous preparation was exactly what would make him an ideal astronaut. The transition from test pilot to space explorer was not a leap, but a natural progression, built on a foundation of thousands of hours of disciplined, analytical flight. As the 1960s approached, the hangars at Edwards began to house strange new shapes, vehicles designed not just to break speed records, but to leave the atmosphere entirely. Armstrong watched these developments with quiet interest, his engineer's mind already calculating the challenges ahead. The legacy of those years at Edwards is not found in dramatic stories, but in the steady accumulation of knowledge. Armstrong's time as a test pilot taught him that courage is not the absence of fear, but the ability to function flawlessly despite it. He learned to trust the data, to verify every assumption, and to remain detached from his own emotions. These lessons would prove invaluable when he later faced the unknowns of space. The desert, with its harsh beauty, had forged a man who could look at the impossible and see a series of solvable problems. And so, when the call came to join NASA's astronaut corps, he was ready, not as a hero seeking glory, but as an engineer stepping into a new kind of cockpit. The morning light filters through the tall windows of the Manned Spacecraft Center in Houston, casting long, quiet shadows across the polished floors. In a sparsely furnished conference room, a group of men sit in silence. Among them is Neil Armstrong, a civilian test pilot with an engineer's steady gaze and a reputation for unshakable calm. It is September 1962, and he has just been selected as one of NASA's second group of astronauts, known as the New Nine. The air is thick with anticipation, not of celebration, but of the immense work ahead. Armstrong, who once flew the X-15 to the edge of space, now faces a new frontier, one that will demand every ounce of his analytical mind and quiet courage. Armstrong's journey to this room began years earlier, in the high desert of Edwards Air Force Base, where he flew experimental aircraft that pushed the boundaries of speed and altitude. As a test pilot for the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, later NASA, he logged over 2,400 hours in more than 200 different aircraft, from gliders to the rocket-powered X-1V. His approach was methodical, never impulsive. Colleagues noted how he would sit in the cockpit before a flight, running through every switch and system in his mind, building a mental model of the machine. This engineering mindset, rooted in his Purdue University training, set him apart. When NASA called for a new group of astronauts, Armstrong submitted his application a week after the deadline, but a former colleague slipped it into the pile, recognizing his exceptional talent. The selection process was grueling: physical exams, psychological tests, and technical interviews. Armstrong's quiet confidence and deep understanding of flight systems made him an ideal candidate, and on September 17, 1962, he was introduced to the world as an astronaut. The training that followed was relentless. The Gemini program, designed to test the techniques needed for a lunar mission, required the astronauts to master orbital mechanics, rendezvous, and docking, all while enduring the physical stresses of spaceflight. Armstrong spent countless hours in simulators, where engineers threw failure after failure at the crews. He studied the spacecraft's schematics until he could trace every wire and valve in his mind. In the centrifuge, his body was pressed into the seat at 8 times the force of gravity, yet his focus remained on the instruments. In the zero-gravity aircraft, known as the Vomit Comet, he practiced maneuvering in weightlessness, his movements deliberate and precise. The training was not just about physical endurance, it was about building a reflexive understanding of the spacecraft, so that in a crisis, the correct action would come without hesitation. Armstrong embraced this challenge, often staying late to run extra simulations, his calm demeanor a steadying influence on his peers. On March 16, 1966, Armstrong climbed into the cramped cockpit of Gemini 8, alongside pilot David Scott, for a mission that would include the first docking of 2 spacecraft in orbit. The Florida morning was clear, the Atlantic stretching out like a sheet of glass as the Titan II rocket ignited and pushed them skyward. The launch was smooth, and within hours, they had rendezvoused with an unmanned Agena target vehicle. The docking was flawless, a delicate ballet of metal and momentum. For a brief moment, the combined craft drifted silently above the Earth, a triumph of engineering and human skill. But then, without warning, the spacecraft began to roll. At first, Armstrong suspected a problem with the Agena, so he undocked, as per procedure. The roll only worsened, accelerating into a violent spin, nearly 1 revolution per second. The Gemini capsule tumbled, the horizon spinning past the windows in a sickening blur. The G-forces built, threatening to render the astronauts unconscious. In that moment, Armstrong's training and engineering instinct took over. He recognized that the problem was not the Agena, but a stuck thruster on their own spacecraft, firing continuously and draining their maneuvering fuel. With the spin rate increasing and communication with ground control intermittent, he had no time to wait for instructions. He switched off the main thruster system and activated the re-entry control system, a separate set of small rockets designed for returning to Earth. His hands moved across the panel with practiced precision, his voice steady as he called out each step to Scott. The spinning slowed, then stopped, and the capsule stabilized. The crisis had lasted only a few minutes, but it had consumed most of their re-entry fuel, forcing an emergency landing in the Pacific Ocean. Armstrong's quick thinking had saved their lives, but he spoke of it later with characteristic modesty, simply noting that the solution was obvious once the problem was understood. The Gemini 8 mission was cut short, but it revealed something profound about Armstrong. In the face of a life-threatening emergency, he did not panic. He did not freeze. He analyzed the situation, eliminated the variables, and acted with the cool precision of an engineer troubleshooting a malfunctioning machine. This was the essence of his contribution to spaceflight, not just bravery, but a deep, quiet competence. The incident solidified his reputation within NASA, and when the time came to select commanders for the Apollo missions, his name was at the top of the list. The experience of Gemini 8, though harrowing, became a lesson in the value of preparation and the power of a disciplined mind. It was a testament to the idea that the greatest explorers are not those who are fearless, but those who have trained themselves to fear correctly, to channel their adrenaline into focused action. As Armstrong walked away from the recovery ship that day, he was already looking ahead, knowing that the next step would be even greater. The vast hangar of the Kennedy Space Center hums with the quiet activity of engineers in white coveralls, their footsteps echoing off the concrete floor. In the center, bathed in the cool glow of fluorescent lights, stands the lunar module, a fragile-looking craft of gold foil and angular legs, more insect than machine. Neil Armstrong walks slowly around it, his eyes tracing the lines of the ascent stage, the tiny windows, the spindly ladder that will one day carry him down to an alien world. It is early 1969, and the Apollo 11 mission is only months away. The air is thick with the scent of metal and the faint tang of cleaning solvents. Armstrong pauses, places a hand on the module's cold surface, and considers the weight of what is to come. He is not just a pilot here. He is a commander, an engineer, and a student of a machine that must work perfectly, far from any hope of rescue. The lunar module, or LM, was unlike anything ever built. Designed by Grumman Aircraft, it was a testament to functional engineering, stripped of every unnecessary ounce to save weight. Its walls were so thin that a dropped tool could puncture them. Armstrong had been involved in its development for years, flying the Lunar Landing Research Vehicle, a bizarre contraption nicknamed the Flying Bedstead, which used a jet engine to simulate the moon's 1/6 gravity. The training was dangerous. In 1968, he had to eject from the vehicle moments before it crashed. Yet he persisted, logging hundreds of flights to master the delicate art of piloting a craft with no aerodynamic control, where every movement had to be calculated in terms of thrust and fuel. In the simulators, he practiced the final descent over and over, facing computer alarms, engine failures, and boulder-strewn landing sites. Each run was a lesson in composure, a rehearsal for the moment when his heart rate would inevitably rise, but his hands must remain steady. Armstrong's role as commander extended beyond piloting. He was responsible for the crew's training, the mission's timeline, and the countless decisions that would be made in real time. He spent days in the cramped Apollo Command Module simulator, running through launch, translunar coast, and re-entry, building a mental map of every switch and procedure. With Buzz Aldrin and Michael Collins, he rehearsed the intricate dance of docking and undocking, the transfers between modules, the choreography of a spacewalk. The training was exhaustive, but Armstrong approached it with the same methodical dedication he had shown throughout his career. He studied the lunar geology so that when he collected rocks, he would know what to look for. He practiced the planting of the flag, the deployment of experiments, the simple act of walking in a pressurized suit. Every detail was scrutinized, every contingency planned. The responsibility, he felt, was immense, not just to his crew and NASA, but to the millions of people who had worked on the program and the billions who would be watching. The question of who would take the first step was never formally discussed in the early planning, but as the mission drew near, it became a matter of quiet deliberation. The lunar module's design placed the commander on the left, near the hatch, while the lunar module pilot stood on the right, blocked by the instrument panel. The physical layout made it natural for the commander to exit first. Additionally, Armstrong's seniority, his experience on Gemini 8, and his temperament all pointed toward him. He was not a man who sought the spotlight. In fact, he seemed almost uncomfortable with the idea of fame. But he accepted the role with a sense of duty, understanding that the first human to set foot on another world would carry a symbolic weight that transcended any individual. In private moments, he thought about what he might say, knowing that his words would be heard across the ages. He settled on a simple, declarative statement, one that would speak to the achievement of all humankind, not just one man. The months leading to launch were a blur of final checks and briefings. The Saturn V rocket, a towering monument to human ambition, stood on the pad, its white flanks gleaming in the Florida sun. Armstrong walked the gantry, looking up at the engines that would carry him beyond the sky. He reviewed the flight plan, a document as thick as a novel, until he could recite its critical phases from memory. He sat in the command module during a plugs-out test, the spacecraft sealed and running on internal power, while technicians monitored every system. The countdown was a symphony of voices and data, and at its center, Armstrong remained a calm, quiet presence. He knew the risks. The rocket could explode, the engine could fail, the lunar surface could be too soft to support the module. Yet his confidence was rooted not in optimism, but in preparation. He trusted the engineering, the teams, and his own ability to respond to the unexpected. The night before the launch, he slept soundly, his mind clear and ready. The next day, he would walk to the transfer van, wave to the crowd, and begin the journey that would define an era. But for now, in the quiet of the hangar, he was just an engineer, standing before a machine, preparing to do his job. The morning of July 16, 1969, dawned hot and humid over the Florida coast. At the Kennedy Space Center, the massive Saturn V rocket stood bathed in the early light, its white surface gleaming against the deep blue sky. A gentle breeze stirred the flags along the viewing stands, where 1 million people had gathered, their faces a mixture of hope and anxiety. Inside the command module Columbia, 3 men lay strapped on their couches, waiting. Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins had trained for this moment for years, but now, in the quiet before ignition, there was only the hum of instruments and the steady rhythm of their breathing. The countdown echoed across the marshlands, a calm voice marking the final seconds. Then, with a roar that shook the earth, the engines ignited, and the rocket rose slowly, impossibly, on a pillar of fire, carrying humanity's dreams toward the moon. For 3 days, Apollo 11 sailed through the silent void, a tiny speck of life in an infinite darkness. The crew moved through their routines with practiced ease, checking systems, navigating by the stars, and sending back glimpses of Earth growing smaller in the window. Armstrong, ever the engineer, monitored every detail, his voice steady in the radio transmissions. As they entered lunar orbit, the moon's surface revealed itself in stark relief, craters and mountains cast in long shadows, a landscape untouched and ancient. On July 20th, Armstrong and Aldrin climbed into the lunar module Eagle and began their descent. Almost immediately, alarms sounded. The computer was overloaded, flashing error codes no one had seen in training. In mission control, a young engineer named Steve Bales made the call. It was safe to continue. Armstrong's heart rate climbed, but his voice remained calm. "Go for landing," he acknowledged. As Eagle dropped lower, Armstrong looked out the window and saw their intended landing site, a field of boulders, impossible to set down safely. He took manual control, flying the lander like the test pilot he was, skimming over the rugged terrain with fuel draining fast. The seconds stretched. Mission Control held its breath. Then, with only 25 seconds of fuel remaining, a puff of dust, a gentle shudder. "Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed." In that moment, the tension of years dissolved into quiet relief. On Earth, cheers erupted, but aboard Eagle, the 2 men simply shook hands and began preparing for the next step. Armstrong later reflected that the landing itself was his greatest concern. The walk, by comparison, was a known quantity. Hours later, after donning his bulky suit and testing the life support systems, Armstrong opened the hatch and backed slowly down the ladder. The world watched on grainy black-and-white television, 240,000 miles away. He paused on the footpad, describing the fine, powdery surface, like charcoal dust. Then, at 9:56 p.m. Houston time, he placed his left boot onto the moon. That's one small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind. The words, slightly garbled by transmission, were not rehearsed. They had come to him during the flight, a simple statement that captured both the personal and the universal. Aldrin joined him minutes later, and together they stood in the eerie silence, moving with a careful, bouncing gait in the 1/6 gravity. The astronauts set to work, their movements deliberate and methodical. They planted the American flag, its pole designed to stand stiff in the airless void, and uncovered a plaque, "We came in peace for all mankind." They collected rocks and soil, packing them into sealed containers, over 47 pounds of material that would later reveal the moon's volcanic history. They deployed scientific instruments, a seismometer to measure moonquakes, a laser reflector that still measures the Earth-Moon distance with precision. The surface was stark, a palette of grays and tans, with no wind, no sound but their own breathing. Armstrong's footprints, sharp and clear, would remain for millennia. After 2.5 hours, they climbed back into Eagle, leaving behind a silent monument to human curiosity. The Apollo program was born from the fierce competition of the Cold War, a race to demonstrate technological superiority. Critics pointed to its staggering cost, over $25 billion, a figure that could have funded schools or housing. Some called it a distraction from earthly problems. And in the decades that followed, a small but persistent group of conspiracy theorists claimed the landing was faked, pointing to perceived anomalies in the photographs. Yet the evidence is overwhelming. Hundreds of thousands of engineers built the hardware, independent tracking stations worldwide confirmed the signals, and the returned samples are unlike any Earth rock. Armstrong, typically, never engaged with the doubters. He knew what he had done, and he trusted the work. As the Eagle ascended to rejoin Collins in orbit, Armstrong looked back at the receding surface. He had carried with him a piece of the Wright Flyer's wing, a tribute to the pioneers of flight. The journey home was a time of reflection, the blue Earth growing larger each day. Splashdown in the Pacific, quarantine in a sterile trailer, and then a world tour. Smiling crowds, handshakes, medals. But Armstrong remained, at his core, the quiet engineer from Ohio. He had done his job, and he had done it well. The moon, once a distant light in the night sky, was now a place where human footprints marked the dust, a testament to what can be achieved when discipline and wonder walk hand in hand. In the summer of 1971, Neil Armstrong walked across the campus of the University of Cincinnati, the Ohio sun warm on his shoulders. He was no longer an astronaut. He had resigned from NASA the year before, quietly, without fanfare. The decision surprised many, but for Armstrong, it was a natural step. He had flown to the moon, but he had always been an engineer first, and now he sought a different kind of challenge. He accepted a position as a professor of aerospace engineering, and on his first day, he arrived early, carrying a briefcase and a slide rule. The students in his classroom saw a tall, soft-spoken man in a tweed jacket who wrote equations on the blackboard with precise handwriting. He never mentioned Apollo unless someone asked, and even then, he deflected with humility. He was simply Professor Armstrong, and his lessons focused on the fundamentals of flight, the beauty of a well-designed wing, the patience required to solve a complex problem. His teaching style was calm and methodical, much like his piloting. He favored small classes where he could know each student by name, and he often stayed late to help with difficult concepts. The university gave him a modest office, its shelves lined with textbooks and a few mementos, a model of the X-15, a photo of his fellow Apollo 11 crew, but no grand displays. He avoided the spotlight, declining most interview requests and public appearances. When he did speak, it was usually about the future of aviation or the importance of engineering education. He believed that the real heroes of Apollo were the thousands of people who built the spacecraft, and he saw his role as merely one part of a vast collaborative effort. This quiet life was his sanctuary, a place where he could contribute without the weight of celebrity. At home, Armstrong found solace in simple routines. He lived on a farm in Lebanon, Ohio, where he tended cattle and repaired fences. The barn, a weathered red structure, became his workshop, filled with tools and the smell of hay. He flew a small plane for pleasure, sometimes taking students up to demonstrate aerodynamics firsthand. His neighbors knew him as a friendly but private man, always willing to lend a hand but never seeking recognition. He served on corporate boards, including those of aerospace companies, where his calm, analytical mind was valued. Yet he always insisted on working behind the scenes, avoiding any role that might put him in front of a camera. His legacy, he felt, was not in the fame, but in the work itself, the meticulous calculations, the test flights, the quiet moments of problem-solving that made the impossible possible. As the years passed, Armstrong watched the space program evolve with a mixture of hope and concern. He supported the shuttle program and the International Space Station, but he worried that the public's interest in exploration was waning. He believed that a society must always push its boundaries, not for glory, but for knowledge and for the practical benefits that come from striving. He rarely gave speeches, but when he did, he spoke of the moon landing not as an end, but as a beginning, a demonstration that humanity could achieve great things when united by a common goal. His words were measured, never boastful, always pointing to the future. He carried with him a quiet sadness for the astronauts lost in the pursuit, but he never let it overshadow the progress made. In his later years, Armstrong's health declined, but his mind remained sharp. He continued to correspond with colleagues and students, offering advice in his characteristic concise style. He passed away on August 25, 2012, at the age of 82, following complications from heart surgery. The news spread quietly, and tributes poured in from around the world. Yet, true to his wishes, his memorial service was private, held on a clear Ohio day. His family scattered his ashes over the Atlantic Ocean, the same waters where he had once splashed down after his historic voyage. He left behind no grand autobiography, no tell-all interviews, only the example of a life lived with dignity and purpose. Today, Armstrong's legacy endures not in monuments, but in the inspiration he provides to countless engineers, pilots, and dreamers. His footprints on the moon remain untouched, but his greater impact is in the minds he shaped, the students who learned from him that precision and humility are not opposites, but partners. He showed that the quietest voices can carry the farthest, and that true exploration is not about seeking fame, but about doing one's job with absolute dedication. As new generations look to the moon and beyond, they walk in the path he first traced, a path of careful steps and steady hearts. The man who took that one small step spent the rest of his life demonstrating that the giant leap was not just a moment, but a way of being.